When I was a boy, I remember learning about Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in school and being immediately fascinated with this incredible American figure. His courage, his zeal, his ability to change the way a whole nation thinks and acts. I also remember vaguely thinking, well, he's called Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. What is he, a doctor? What does it mean to be a reverend? And I never heard those two titles addressed. It wasn't until later in my postgraduate studies that I started reading his own speeches in his own words and starting to get some answers to that. He was a reverend because he was a Baptist preacher. And he was a doctor because he had a doctorate in theology. At first I didn't quite understand if that was just accidental to his powerful social convictions about bringing an end to segregation and this great defense of human rights. But when I started to read him, I discovered how absolutely essential and organically linked to his convictions of human rights that those two titles stand for. What do I mean? Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King wrote this beautiful letter called Letter from a Birmingham Jail. And what he says in here is his frustration is shallow understanding from people of goodwill. What does he mean by shallow understanding? He was addressing this letter to clergymen, and he was frustrated that they weren't standing up for human rights the same way he was. Why was he standing up for human rights with the zeal and the tenacity, and especially the non-violent convictions with which he did? He was doing it because he had a conviction in the Creator God. Now he's a Christian Baptist minister. What's a Christian? It's someone who believes that the God of Israel has taken flesh in the Messiah, the Son of God, Jesus Christ. Well, what does it mean to believe in the God of Israel? It means that you believe in the one who non-violently creates everything. What does that have to do with rights? What is a right? A right is giving someone what's their due. How do you know what's due to someone? You recognize what they are. Example, a frog has a right to hop. True or false? You say it's true. Well, how do you know that? Because you look at what the frog can do. It's got these little legs that help it hop. When you see what it can do, you see what it is. And now you're at the deepest level of creation. Who made that thing a frog? Well, we say God did. Now that's not primarily like some religious, faith-based thing, as much as it is recognizing that what things are, recognizable by reason, precedes human choice, and it precedes government power. Back to Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He looks at segregation through that lens. He sees that a human being is a rational animal, right? We're mammals, we have bodies, and yet we're more than that. We have a soul, we have freedom, we have intellect and will. That gives us a dignity the animals don't have. The color of our skin is incidental, it's accidental to what we are. The color of your skin can change, and that doesn't change what you are as a rational animal with all the dignity that obtains from that existence, that essence, that nature. That allowed Dr. King to now move into the social arena and say segregation is wrong, not because it's primarily economically bad or sociologically bad, but because it's morally bad. Back to his letter from a Birmingham jail, he quotes, of all people in this letter, Thomas Aquinas, who was a Dominican Catholic priest who wrote 800 years before, and he said, he's talking about whether a law is just or unjust, and he says, a just law, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law. Now, what does he mean by that? He means that human laws don't create out of nothing human rights. They recognize them and then seek to protect them and promote them. He points out in this same letter, look, everything that Hitler did against the Jews and against other innocent people was legal. That doesn't mean it was right. And he says the Hungarian fighters for freedom against communism, everything they did was considered illegal. But does that mean it was wrong? No, because human law doesn't create rights, it merely recognizes them. So where do they come from? The Creator. It comes from what things are. This conviction, I think, is so important for us today because of all of the concerns for human rights that we should have today teeter on an eroding foundation if we think it's just my own opinion. Because then when the going gets tough, when the government says, oh, we're going to threaten you with violence, we back away. Because we teeter on this fear that maybe human rights are rooted in just my own opinion. Maybe it is just up to the powerful to decide. That wasn't Dr. King's conviction. What was his conviction? Rights are rooted in the Creator God's gift of what things are. We recognize that through reason. Now, this allowed him to be an extremist, a non-violent extremist. And at the end of the letter, he quotes that how this conviction in the Creator God gives rise to incredible, efficacious and zealous work for human rights. He says, was not Amos the prophet in the Old Testament an extremist for justice? Was not Paul in the New Testament an extremist? Was not John Bunyan, the Puritan writer, an extremist? What about Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson? They were all extremists for human rights. Why? Because with all of their different external religious differences, they had the same conviction that rights come from the Creator. So let's remember that Martin Luther King was a doctor of theology and a Baptist preacher. He was a reverend doctor of theology. That will help us to be zealous for human rights wherever they're threatened, even when the going gets tough.